So we're really happy tonight to have David Haskell with us to talk about his new book, Sounds Wild and Broken, which is going to be published in the UK this month, or it's already been published. It's available. Amazing. So that's really great. So everyone go out and buy it. But David is a writer and a biologist, and his books are acclaimed for their integration of science, poetry, and also this rich attention to the living world. He's got a gazillion honors, which I'm not going to read. But the one I think is really exciting is the National Outdoor Book Award for Natural History Literature and a number of other things. And he's currently, he's a Brit. He was born in London and has his degree from Oxford. He has a PhD from Cornell University, just like me. And he's currently a Guggenheim Fellow and the William R. Keenan Professor at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. And he comes to us tonight from Atlanta, Georgia, where spring apparently is in absolutely full flow. And it's probably warmer than it is here today in London. And he's going to talk to us about his book where he explores the past of sound on Earth and considers its future. And I'm really looking forward to what you have to say tonight, David. And thank you so much for coming along, even though you'd probably really rather be out looking at the wildflowers. Thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for that wonderful introduction. It is indeed a delight to be with you all. And I send my greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, where spring has most definitely sprung. We're moving into the early parts of summer. And outside the windows here, I have great big white oak trees that are full of birds that will shortly be in the boreal forests. I feel that I'm in the middle of a great river of bird migration, feasting on the productivity of the land here. So what we currently call Atlanta, Georgia, is the original custodians of this land were the Muskogee Creek, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I offer my thanks also to the Linnean Society for inviting me, and salute you for this work of connecting authors and scientists, other naturalists, even in the challenges of the pandemic, and then the later stages of the pandemic. Maybe we're moving into the Mesozoic of the pandemic now, to form these connections across the boundaries of geography, and for some of limitation of movement. It really is a life-giving thing that you're doing within the human community of life, but then also, of course, out beyond the human, because part of the intent of the Linnean Society is to turn our attention, our curiosity, indeed our senses, out to the rest of the living world. So thank you, Sandy Knapp, for that very kind introduction. Thank you also to Padma Ghosh, who did amazing work arranging, first inviting me and then arranging the logistics and publicity for this particular event, and to Tatiana Franco, who facilitated my nomination for a fellowship. So my great thanks to all of you. So well, let's start off with a few sounds, shall we? I'm sharing my screen here, and I'm going to take you to the Ecuadorian rainforest. And what we're doing here is we're standing in the top of a ceibo tree. We're about 9 or 10 stories above the ground, measured in terms of human buildings. It's very humid, of course, very warm, and this is one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, not too far from the equator, and in the very western part of the Amazon, so eastern Ecuador. So I'm gonna press play here, and this is the sounds of this forest, just a few seconds of those sounds at dawn. And what I'd like you to do is listen for the different layers that are present, the multitude of voices, because unlike a deciduous woodland, say in the UK or in much of Western Europe, or indeed here in the United States, here there's an order of magnitude more sound going on. So see how many different layers you can pull out as we listen here. And then now let's fast forward through the day and then into the evening. I was going to show you a shot of the night in the Amazon, but it's just a blank slide because, of course, it's very, very dark underneath the canopy. And this recording is from about 2 o'clock in the morning. And you will hear not so many. The last recording had monkeys, it had insects, it had all kinds of birds in it. This is mostly insects with a sort of a baseline of crested owls going ooh at the very lowest frequencies. If you're listening on the laptop, the lowest frequencies may not come through for you. And of course, Zoom is optimized for the human voice, not for the other voices of the creatures around us. But we'll do our best here and take a listen. So an extraordinary richness of sound, and to get a visual on this, we can draw a spectrogram, and this is showing just a few seconds. So time is going from left to right on the slide, and on the vertical axis we have frequency. So low frequency sounds are represented by the yellow and white brightness. So these are all visual representations of how the frequencies of sound change over time. And this is the recording we just heard from the daytime. You can see a lot of the frequencies are concentrated down below 5 kilohertz, which is sort of the more or less the range of human music. If you were to record an orchestra, you'd get most of the sound would be down there. And then you've got other things, particularly insects, crickets, katydids, singing up in the higher registers. And this one cuts off at 18 kilohertz, but there are some that go way up into what we would call the ultrasound, beyond the limits of human hearing, which is more or less what's shown on this graph here, up far higher than we can hear. And that's particularly obvious at night. Here's the spectrogram at night. So again, this is just a little more than 15 seconds, time moving from left to right on the graph, frequency on the vertical axis. You can see there are a lot of pretty high-pitched insects. Right now, I'm speaking to you at probably about 500 to 1,000 hertz. So right down here at the bottom, you can see the little blob at the bottom left and the bottom right of this graph. That's the owl going, ooh, ooh. So the little owl sound, and then these layers upon layers of insects on top of that. And each frequency band here is probably one species, although a few species are singing with some harmonics. You can see some are offering continuous trills or tones, others sort of a more pulsed sound, and then there's a few these drops, these sort of randomly scattered spots here are actually the sounds of raindrops falling on the leaves. So a great richness of sound in this most biodiverse place that we know on the planet. What is going on here? Well, there's both order and anarchy happening in the soundscape of this rainforest. And what is true for the rainforest is actually also true for many other soundscape sounds in other ecosystems. So what do I mean by order? Well, the species here have, at least some of them have spread their frequencies out a little bit, so they're not overlapping and masking one another. So there's been a little bit of evolutionary wrangling about which species can sing in which space. So through competition, a little bit of divergence of the sound of the sounds of the creatures in the forest. Also, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, the species have adapted the form of their song. So whether it's high or low frequency, whether it's pulsed, fast or slow, to the vegetation around them and for how far they want their calls to reach out. And so the physical structure of the vegetation around them has also shaped the sounds of the creatures that are singing here. So those are all sort of law-like, predictable ways in which sound manifests in the rainforest. But there's also an anarchic sort of free quality to this. And by anarchy, I mean there's no central controlling hierarchy. We're not hearing the agency or the will or the planning or indeed of the evolution of just one species here. Instead, we're hearing thousands all at once. And this is a very strong contrast to the music that we humans make, because of course, human music serves the aesthetic of one species, and that's us. I mean, that's the point of it, right? So music is to connect one person to another. And in general, there are a few exceptions, but in general, we're not reaching out to other species with our music. Instrumentalists like David Rothenberg here in the United States do a marvelous job of expanding that boundary. But click onto the internet or go to a concert hall or a pub or a rock stadium, and you're hearing sounds that are designed for the human aesthetic. There's also, with human music, one composer or one songwriter shaping the music. And so one species aesthetic and the agency of one person is what we hear in music. Instead, in the rainforest, what we're hearing are thousands of aesthetics that all coexist and compete with one another and find synergies. So there's this marvelous decentering of control and of creativity in the rainforest. That's just magnificent and in fact humbling, because when I'm in the rainforest trying to listen, I have the choice of either focusing on just one species or trying to swim into the whole, but I can't really hear the relationships between them because it's so complicated. Unlike, say, the dawn chorus in a deciduous forest or parkland or grassland in the temperate zone, where it's magnificent, it's wonderfully diverse, but it doesn't far transcend the ability of the human mind to grasp it. So it's very humbling to try to listen in these. So the rainforest is not an orchestra. The rainforest is not a symphony or a song. The rainforest is, in a way, a multiverse of musics, a multiplicity all emerging in relationship with one another, but not from one single created origin. So I'm going to end the slides. We'll come back to a few more slides here in a few minutes and just offer some sort of general comments about this sound and its meanings. What we're hearing is not just the richness of numbers, lots of species, hundreds of species singing together. And the numbers are impressive. In this part of Ecuador, there are 9 species of wild primate. There are hundreds of species, maybe 4, 5, 6, 700 species, depending on which habitat you're in, of birds. So more birds in a few hectares of this forest than in all of North America. There are 60,000 species, as far as we know, 60,000 species of insect, many of which sing in the forest. So a great concentration of biodiversity that manifests itself in the sensory exuberance of the place. So numbers is part of it. But numbers is not just what the senses are about. The senses connect individuals. And so we're hearing some of the stuff that links individual organisms into networks of relationship, of connection, whether it's parents connecting with offspring, mates calling out to one another, social groups like groups of toucans, macaws, pygmy marmosets, insects calling to one another to coordinate the social lives of their groups. So we hear this great magnificence of interconnection. And I think one of the revolutions that's happened in biology lately, and by lately I mean just in, say, the last 20, 30 years, is that we're more and more coming to understand that the fundamental unit of life is not the individual. For years, we've had a very atomistic view of biology. To understand life, you have to understand the gene, the organism, the species. And that's a useful way, a very powerful way of thinking about the world. But the gene can't be understood outside of its context. You can have the sequence of a gene and know very little about what it does within the body, because of course, the function of a gene emerges from its relationship with the regulatory genes that are around it, with the other genes that it interacts with as it makes its proteins and RNAs. And so a gene has to be understood in terms of community. The same with ecosystems. An ecosystem isn't a single entity. An ecosystem is made of relationships and flows of energy and matter within. And organisms. Walk down even the supermarkets understand this. Walk down the dairy aisle of a supermarket, and there are all these things about the microbiome and how this yogurt will help your gut and so on. we understand now culturally that our bodies are not made just out of human cells. Our bodies are living communities of human cells, bacterial cells, virus, fungi, mites on our faces, where we too are walking creatures. And so biology more and more has become a study of relationships. The fundamental unit of life isn't the individual or the self. The fundamental unit and process of life is interconnection and relationship. And selves, individuals, are temporary aggregations and manifestations and convergences of those relationships. Okay, so that's all very philosophical. What does it have to do with the senses? Well, the senses for organisms are the way in which those relationships are founded, formed, and mediated. So without sensory connection to other beings, those life-giving processes of exchange, whether it's social connection or finding out about food or predators or the nature of the weather or what's happening with the cycle of the seasons, without the senses, we're cut off from that information, from those connections. So the study of the senses, whether it's sound or chemical communication or visual communication, is as fundamental as other parts of understanding the so-called environment, the environ, which is also ourselves. The term environment is problematic because its etymology implies an otherness of the self embedded in surroundings, whereas in fact we are part of that connection, that interconnection that gives life. So life is made of interconnection. The senses for organisms are the things which make that connection happen. And so we can learn an awful lot about life and about evolution and evolution's creativity by studying the senses as a complement to other forms of study. For example, the language of statistics. How many species are here? What is the rate of increase or decline in this species? Or the language of chemistry. What is the concentration, or of physics, the concentration of this gas in the atmosphere? And how does that relate to then the physical warming or cooling of the planet and the biogeochemistry of the planet? So alongside the language of chemistry and of statistics, we also need the language of the senses, which means that aesthetics, which is the appreciation and study and curiosity about the senses, has a place within biology. So paying attention to the senses is a very important complement to other approaches of studying the environment. Now, we started with some sounds from the rainforest, but the world was not always as sonically diverse. For 9/10 of its history, in fact, this planet lacked, as far as we know, communicative voices. And by communicative voices, I mean animal sounds whose evolutionary behavioral intent is to connect one creature to another in the way that I'm doing now. So I'm causing the air to vibrate. It's being picked up by a little microphone here that is then transmitting to vibrations in air to your ears. A form of communication with the intent of one organism connecting to another. For 9/10 of its history, Earth lacked those communicative voices. The primal sounds of Earth, of course, before life evolved, were the sound of wind rushing across mountain peaks, of waves beating against rocks, of lightning, of geologic tremors. We can still hear these primal sounds today, and that's an extraordinary thing. You go to the seaside or hear a little brook running down through some rocks, you're hearing the very same kinds of sounds that were around on this Earth 3.5–4 billion years ago. You have a direct sensory connection to one aspect of that primal Earth in a way that we can't do for other things. You can look at an old rock, say from deep down in the Precambrian period, a very ancient rock, and you're connected to that deep time, but in a rather abstract way, you're not there. Listen to the rain falling on rocks or listening to the howl of the wind strafing a seashore, and you're transported back to that primal Earth. Okay, so no communicative sounds before animals evolved. That's fairly self-evident, I think. When bacteria and single-celled organisms, eukaryotic organisms evolved, also, as far as we know, no communicative sounds. Bacteria do make little shivering motions on their cell surfaces that send trembling waves sound waves in water out to their surroundings. And interestingly, if you play those same sounds back to flasks of bacteria, their growth rate goes up. So there's definitely a sensitivity to sound, but as far as we know, there's no sort of communication happening there. And I say as far as we know, because there are only about a dozen papers that have ever investigated the possibility of sonic communication in bacteria. So that's an interesting avenue for any naturalist with a can for the very, very small. After that, the evolution of complex animals, starting about 575 million years ago in the Ediacaran period, and going on into the Cambrian. Eventually, complex eyes, limbs, jointed skeletons, sophisticated digestive organs evolved. But as far as we can tell, no communicative devices like little stridulating parts on trilobites, or things that pectoral girdles that can make clicking sounds in fish the way modern fish do now. No fossil evidence whatsoever from that until late into the Permian. So it took about 300 million years over the history of the first evolution of complex animals for communicative sound to first evolve. Why such a long silence? It wasn't because evolution was lacking any creative powers. After all, evolution produced most of the animal file that we have today, and things like complex eyes and limbs. Likely it was the fact that making a sound was just very, very dangerous. All animals, right from the get-go, were endowed with cilia, little hairs on and in their bodies that could pick up vibrations in the environment around them. This was true for the creatures in the ocean and also for the first animals that came onto land. That sensitivity to vibrations, if you're a predator, leads you to your prey. Therefore, for any organism to make a sound is to vastly increase the risk of predation. And to this day, small and defenseless and slow creatures tend not to make sound. Think about salamanders. They are silent. Yet their cousins, the frogs, which have powerful jumping legs and can get away from predators, the frogs make the sound. Jellyfish, worms, snails, amazingly diverse creatures, all sorts of amazing life histories and anatomical adaptations, but they're not vocal. Whereas birds, some fish, mammals, a lot of insects are making sound, and these are the creatures that are fierce and fast and can get away from predation. So this is speculative, but a hypothesis for why sound took so long to evolve, communicative sound took so long to evolve on Earth, was that predation kept a lid on it until the evolution of things like insect wings, powerful jumping legs, defensive mechanisms that allowed creatures to escape. So what does the fossil evidence say about some of the first communicative sounds on the planet? So let me share my screen again here and show you, excuse me. Back to the PowerPoint here. This is a fossil from the Permian period from the Massif Central in France of an insect called Permistridulus, discovered by André Betou and his colleagues. This is, you can see it's a fossilized wing. And right here in the top right is a raised ridge with a series of little nubs that they interpret as a stridulation device. So this is a ridge just like the little ridges on the wings of crickets, katydids, and other modern insects that rub their wings together to make sound. So the sound is produced when the ridge rubs across the base of the opposite wing and a little raspy sound comes out. This is not an ancient cricket or a katydid. This belongs to a group of organisms that are now extinct, but it's a close relative of those of modern orthopterans, like katydids and crickets. Okay, so here's a close-up of that ridge. You can see there's a series of little nubs here. And what I did was take measurements of the spacing of those little nubs along the ridge of the wing, compare that and compare the size and the dimension, the overall dimensions of the sound-making ridge to those of modern singing insects, and then make a speculative reconstruction of what this sound might have been. I say speculative because, of course, we don't know how fast the wing was rubbing, exactly how one wing made contact with another, and so we're into the realm of informed recreations here rather than definitive reconstructions. The little raised parts, the nubs on this ridge, are much more widely spaced and much more irregularly spaced than most singing crickets, for example, today. The closest analog are the mole crickets of North America that have fairly big ridges with widely spaced teeth. And so what I did was use the mole cricket as a basis. I took a recording of a mole cricket and then reduced the number of sound waves, spaced them out, added some irregularity to recreate this little chorus of what Permistridulus might have sounded like. So some sounds perhaps from the Permian, these little raspy sounds. And the function of these sounds we don't know, of course. Maybe it was for mate attraction. Maybe it was for a defensive little signal, the way you pick up lots of insects today. They give a little sound as a defensive mechanism, and boom, they can escape from predators that are around them. After the evolution of this forerunner, if you like, Permistridulus, through the Triassic and the Jurassic, there's good fossil evidence of other singing creatures that have wing ridges just very much more similar to those of modern insects today. And so it's clear that the insects, particularly the orthopterans, crickets, katydids, were some of the first singers on land on this planet. Now, in the ocean, the story is a little more murky because the sound-making devices of many fish involve muscles on their swim bladders, and those kinds of structures don't fossilize very well. So it's quite possible that creatures like sturgeon and the ancestors of sturgeon, which are around for like last 300 million years, may have been making groaning, booming sounds in the water, and we just haven't found convincing fossil evidence of that yet. We can infer the presence of those sounds perhaps from genealogical evolutionary trees from the modern day. Spiny lobsters, which you can still see they're still reasonably common in oceans, particularly warmer oceans around the world, have rubbed their antennae on the little groove at the base of the antennae, make a squeaking sound. That is possibly, and they were around about the same time as Permistridulus. Those are contenders for some of the first sound makers in the oceans. But here on land, it was the insects. And so when we go to somewhere where we are wrapped in an insect chorus today, we are transported back to the first days of sound on this earth. And I'm going to play you a chorus from a meadow in Tennessee here in the United States in late summer, so in September. And you can hear the multiple layers. There are half a dozen species singing at once here. So imagine yourself back in the Jurassic as you're hearing this. Of course, it wouldn't be exactly the same species, but the overall vibe and the timbre and tempo would be similar. This recording, I've also progressively slowed down so that you can hear these very rapidly stridulating insects at a speed that is more graspable by the human ears. And the last segment of this little recording is slowed down to a quarter time, and you'll hear some high-pitched sounds there, which in the first recording are far beyond the ken of any human ear. So this is not only a little sort of a time traveling exercise, but also an exercise into understanding that our ears only hear a very limited portion of the sonic spectrum today. So I hope some of that was coming through the strangeness, the tight filters of Zoom here. I should mention that all these sounds and more are on my website at dghaskell.com. And so you can put on headphones and hear high quality versions of these sounds. So after the initial evolution of the first communicative sound makers on the planet, there followed a great flourishing of sounds, of course, bit by bit, new voices being added to the chorus till we get to the modern day. In my book, I try and reconstruct and trace some of that, not just about like who sang when, but bigger emphasis on why did sound get so diverse. It's not just that we have a few creatures all making a few little raspy croak sounds. Instead, a remarkable thing about the vocal expression on this planet is how varied it is. So what caused sonic evolution to be powered into all these diverse ways of making sound is one of the questions that I try and explore through the book. Today, I'll just mention 3 of those factors. What caused the diversification and the increased sophistication of sound making through time? And I hope in discussing this will reframe some of your experiences of listening in the present day. Because in casting our ears back into the past, we're also trying to sort of understand our world as it is now. And so when you go listening in a woodland or on a city park, what are you hearing and why is some of the questions that I'd like you to come away with from this talk with. So the first thing that causes an increased diversification of sound is an adaptation of each species' voice to its environment. So for example, woodland birds tend to sing with fairly slow, whistled, slurred songs, and that those songs transmit pretty well through the great confusion of leaves and twigs and trunks that add all kinds of reverberation and degradation to the sound for any bird that is singing over more than a few meters. And so in order to get your voice through that, you have to have a fairly slow whistled melody, because those are the kinds of sounds that don't get too muddied and whose signal is still clear when you're hearing 10, 20, 50 meters away. And one example of that is the summer tanager here. So I'll play the tanager. This is a bird that I saw one just yesterday outside my office in Tennessee. Whoop. Okay, tanager, play, please. So beautiful, slow whistle. It's on the tempo that the human mind can grasp. And we tend to find these sorts of songs very pleasing. Now, on the right, we have lark sparrow, which breeds in the open grasslands in the central part of the United States and out into the West, where there is no problem with lots of leaves getting in the way. And so they have a much faster, trilled, very virtuosic kind of sound. Okay, great. I mean, my mind can't quite keep track of all that's going on in that sound. And this contrast that I'm showing you just 2 examples here, so a sort of anecdotal example, has been found again and again to apply across continents. I mean, you go to Australia or Africa or Western Europe, the same thing. Birds in dense woodland tend to have slow whistled songs, and those of open country tend to have much more trilled, rapid songs. There are some exceptions, and of course, the exceptions are interesting to study because often they have their own particular reasons for diverging from the general rule. But these are examples of species adapting their sounds to place. Here's another example. I'm going to play you the sound of wind in the ponderosa pine tree in Colorado. These are the loudest trees I've ever heard in my life. It's the slightest little gust evokes a great big low frequency roar. So I think you could hear the roar there. Well, birds and mammals that have to communicate in this environment seem to have adapted their voices to get a little higher frequency than you would expect for their body size, so that they can be heard above the sound of the roar of the wind in the trees. So first we'll hear red crossbills, and the recording here will be red crossbills on their own, and then red crossbills with the wind, and you'll hear them vaulting over the wind. And then elk, which are the sort of the North American equivalent of red deer, making their high-pitched bugling sounds, followed by the bugling sounds overlaying on some wind noise. And yeah, hopefully you'll see the avoidance of masking, or rather you'll hear the avoidance of masking. Again, just two examples to sort of illustrate the general point that the physical environment shapes and causes diversity in the sounds that non-human animals make. Other examples, birds on the seashore, of course, making loud, strident calls to get over the roar of the waves. Whales that call near shore have a different kind of sound than whales that are calling offshore. So in the water, there's also this level of adaptation, even in solid surfaces. So a lot of insects sing by sitting on a twig and then sending vibrations down through their legs into the twig. And then the waves move not through the air, but through the twig itself, and then up through the legs of another insect. And so they're calling and listening through their legs with solid wood as the medium. Well, it turns out that the kind of wood and the kind of the species of tree that these insects are singing on shapes the sound of the call. Depending on the form of wood, the call is changed. So local adaptation is one thing. But this local adaptation then meets the legacies of plate tectonics and of the movement of organisms from one continent to another. So this local adaptation is just one small part of the diversifying forces of the world. I'll play you an example here of woodland birds from Australia, from Queensland, Australia, and then from the southern United States here. And listen for the totally different sound of these two woodlands that have acoustic transmission properties that are more or less similar to one another. So those of you who've traveled know very well that different continents have very different sounds to them. And so we can hear some of the legacy of biogeographical changes over time. For example, North America, the songbirds in North America arrived here mostly from Asia, but originally from Australia in a couple of waves, one about 18 million years ago, another one about 35 million years ago. And so essentially in North America, we're hearing ancient Australian lineages that colonized North America a few tens of millions of years ago, and then diversified to make their own sounds. So North American blackbirds and vireos and tyrant flycatchers and warblers, all found only in the Americas, have their own sound. Europe, Western Europe, Africa colonized from Asia, and then originally also from Australia. For songbirds about 27 million years ago in a couple of big waves. I mean, there were multiple waves, but a couple of really big ones that left their mark on the world. And so particularly in birdsong, we're hearing this old story that is laying down on the land now, and that we can sense through our ears. For other creatures like crickets and cicadas, crickets and cicadas are very good at just floating on little bits of vegetation from one continent to another, hopping from one place to another. And so the ones in Australia and North America and Europe and so sound very similar to one another, because there's been a lot of movement between continents. So we don't hear quite as much of a signature of plate tectonic divergence of continents and small numbers of migrations of animals that colonize one species, one place, just once or twice, in the way that we do here with birds. So local adaptation and the legacies of deep time, plate tectonics, and biogeography is one thing that we hear in our here in the soundscapes around us. We also hear other processes, and one of those is the legacy of flowers. And it seems an absurd thing to say that flowers somehow are involved in the diversification of sound on this planet. But if you look at the family tree of most species, of most groups of singing organisms today in the terrestrial realm, the katydids, the cicadas, the grasshoppers, moths that do a lot of singing up in the ultrasound, even less directly birds and mammals, there's this great flourishing expansion of diversity right when flowering plants appear on the planet and start evolving. Why is that? Flowering plants form cooperative unions below ground, at least 10 different ways, 10 different evolutionary events where they united, flowering plants united their roots with nitrogen fixing bacteria to essentially fertilize ecosystems in ways that most other plants, the cycads are one exception to that, but most other plants had not been able to do. And then above ground, flowering plants are co-evolving with fruit dispersers, seed predators, pollinators, herbivores in this back and forth evolution that is a great driver of diversification. So out of that ecological maelstrom that emerged out of the evolution of flowering plants, we have diversification of soundscapes. So when we listen to the range of sounds in the world around us, we have flowers in a way to thank for that. Another example of a diversifying force in evolution is the unexpected legacies and repurposing of structures from ancestors. So take the mammals. I'm speaking to you here with my tongue and my lips and my jaw in a way that no reptile can do. Why is that? It's because about 200 million years ago, our great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers evolved the ability to lactate, to produce this gift of milk from mothers directly to their offspring, that of course allowed the offspring to develop very rapidly and not have to feed for themselves. Amazing innovation, and the whole clade, mammalia, is named for the mammary glands that provide that gift. In order to receive that gift, the young mammals had to reconfigure their jaws through evolution to produce sturdier jaws, more complex throat musculature, a wider, more complex hyoid bone, which is a bone up here in the throat. And so the complex and sturdy and nimble mammalian mouth and throat evolved first to suckle, and then later was repurposed to shape sound as it emerges up from the windpipe, from the vocal cords. So, you know, other frogs and reptiles and make sounds, but they're not nearly as good at shaping them. So when we hear human language or a wolf howling or the elk that we just heard, what we're hearing is the legacy of these great-great-grandmothers from 200 million years ago. And this is sort of illustrates a general theme in sonic evolution, that often one structure is repurposed for use in another context. Other examples are the fish swim bladder, which didn't evolve first to make sound, it evolved for buoyancy and gas exchange, or gas regulation at least, that could then turn into sort of an internal loudspeaker that could be set into motion by little vibrating muscles. insect wings, amazing sound makers. The insect wing evolved first for flight, for gliding or for powered flight. But then here you've got this papery structure attached to pulsed muscles, just like a loudspeaker, amazing thing to make sounds with. The bird's syrinx, this unique structure that birds have down in their chest, the confluence of the trachea and the bronchi, repurposed into a sound-making device. So in sonic diversity, we hear both local adaptation and the legacies of deep time, creative powers of flowers, and the unexpected gifts of ancestors. Human music fits into this pattern, particularly as it relates to local adaptation. And let me show you a couple more slides here and one more sound. Okay, so here we're moving forward. We're not a few 100 million years ago. These are flutes from Ice Age caves in what is now southern Germany. They're about 40,000 years old, made from the wing bones of birds like griffon vultures and swans, and also carved out of mammoth ivory. So 40,000 years ago, these are the first known musical instruments anywhere on the planet. And this is something that humans do uniquely. Other species do not craft musical instruments in this way. So these were people who were living very tough lives. What did they choose to do? They used the highest form of technology that they had, which are very sophisticated stone tools, to craft art. In this case, musical art, but also from these very same layers of the cave, there is also three-dimensional figurative art. In fact, the first known examples of three-dimensional sculpture, amazing figurines of human forms, amazing evocations of diving birds and of other creatures that they would have found around them in the ice ages. So if you're in southern Germany, I really encourage you to go to the museums at Tübingen and Blaubeuren and Ulm and see some of these first forms of musical and figurative art, really extraordinary artifacts. And Wolf Hein, who is a modern day expert in reconstruction of things from the Paleolithic, remade a flute out of mammoth ivory using the same kind of tools that people have used 40,000 years ago. And then Anna Potankowski played this instrument. I'm going to play you an example of what this flute sounds like. So amazing. It's very difficult to play this flute, in fact, and it's all about the embouchure, how you connect your mouth and your breath to the top opening there. Extraordinary sounds. Now, what's amazing to me is that what was true for birds and elk and whales out in the ocean is also true for the origins of human music, because this flute music sounds great in caves. So the kind of music that first developed on this planet sounded really good for the space in which it was being played. And that reciprocity between the form of musical instruments and the physical space in which it's being played continues to the present day. So for hundreds of years in the Western musical tradition, most music was heard in relatively small spaces. And so instruments like lutes and guitars were suitable to that. Then in the 19th and 20th century, large concert halls developed. And so the instruments had to be redesigned. The concert hall piano now has strings that are 10 times tighter. And the instrument itself is way louder than the original pianos. Same thing with concert flutes, with violins. They were all reworked in the 19th century to fit the new space in which they're being played. And now when we plug earbuds into our ears, we're creating a new form of musical space. What happens? Music, as it always has, changes to fit that space. The singing voice now, for example, Billie Eilish, her voice is very whispery, almost conspiratorial. Perfect for listening in earbuds, because she's quite literally like in your ear whispering to you. Unlike, say, rock music from the 1970s, which sounded like there were some people up on stage sort of singing into mics out into a larger space, like a stadium or something like that. So as space changes, musical instruments change to fit that space. And this is just what has been happening for tens of millions of years. For other species, this reciprocal relationship between the form of vocalization and the environment in which that vocalization takes place. Now, in closing, let me just say that part of my book, and I haven't focused much on this today, but part of my book is about what I call the crisis of sensory extinction. Because all these magnificent sonic wonders, from the rainforest to the marvels of fish song and whale song in the oceans, and indeed the cultural diversity of human music, are threatened and in fact being lost. In three main ways we have a crisis underway. One is as habitats are lost, for example, as a rainforest is turned into a monoculture plantation of soybeans or of acacia trees, the diversity of sound, of sonic expression is lost from that. And this is evident in any kind of habitat transformation where there's a massive simplification. But what we're losing is not just sensory ornament, but because sound connects one creature to another, we're losing some of the generative power that keeps that ecosystem going, that keeps it together. So as we lose sonic diversity, we lose the ability to adaptation, for resilience. The second form of sonic loss is humans pumping so much noise into the environment that other species cannot hear one another and their social networks fall apart. This, of course, happens in cities. Many species are excluded from cities because of the cacophony we create. Noise in cities is also an environmental injustice issue within the human species. But the place where noise is the worst is in the oceans. We have created a living hell in the world's oceans through shipping noise, but particularly through seismic exploration. As we seek out fossil fuels below the sea surface, below the mud at the bottom of the ocean, we do so by pumping every 10 seconds over months and months these incredibly loud sounds that at close range actually kill any creatures that are close to them, like little plankton, and at a further range turn what was an acoustically nuanced, fairly quiet ocean filled only with the sounds of other organisms and sea ice breaking up, the very occasional volcano, underwater volcano, into a place that is absolutely dominated by human industrial sound. And so this is one of the great crises, I think, of the sensory world right now, and one that can be fixed by using different forms of oil exploration, by using less fossil fuels in our everyday lives, of course, and by technological modifications to ships to make things quieter. And then the third dimension to this loss, this sonic loss, is about us. Is that more and more we're becoming a species that turns inwards, that listens to our voices to the exclusion of other species. So, and I understand that in the UK, there's just been a natural history GCSE approved, which is a marvelous step forward, but across education systems around the world, we don't learn the sounds of the birds and the insects and the snapping shrimp and the fish of local environments. We don't understand we don't get training in how to understand the various languages of the living earth. Rather, we listen to ourselves. And of course, we have devices in our pockets that are designed to draw our attention away from other things onto the screen. And those other things include the voices of the community of life to which we belong. And so I think something as simple as going outside and just enjoying the dawn chorus, or listening to the voices of birds in a city park in the springtime, or understanding how the blackbird singing outside your window from a city apartment building has adapted itself to the urban environment. There were no blackbirds in European cities before the 19th century. This was a bird of the countryside. It's now moved into the city and colonized, showing that the possibility for resilience and adaptation through vocal learning. So my closing invitation to you is to go outside with your ears open, without at first questions, but just with an enthusiastic openness of the senses, and to take on a practice of, say, one street corner, or in your back garden, or in a park or a woodland somewhere nearby, to return again and again and to just listen. Listen to just the pure physicality of the sounds around you, without judgment, without even naming things necessarily, and see where that experience of direct sensory connection takes you. It may ignite curiosity. It may ignite rage about things that you didn't understand about the neighborhood behind it. It may also be an invitation to, let's get some kids involved in this, and just this is a sort of fun activity to draw local children into. So the invitation is to go out with your senses, to listen and see where that listening leads you. With that, I will close and be delighted to take any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I love your idea of the language of the living world. That's just really, it's very beautiful, a very beautiful kind of image to take away with us. Thank you so much. We've got a few questions, and I'm sure that there will be more coming in. Someone has asked about the work of Bernie Krause, who has a thing called the Great. He had an installation called the Great Animal Orchestra. What do you think of his work?
So Bernie is one of those like sort of a prophet for listening. So he has spent decades and decades going around the world making sound recordings of environments, mostly away from cities, and has shared those recordings with people to wake up the human species to the marvels of the living earth, the sonic marvels of the earth, and also how those marvels are being degraded. And so, I mean, his work is extremely influential, extremely important. He is someone, at the very beginning of the talk, I mentioned that when I listen to a rainforest, I hear both order and anarchy. He is someone who has very much emphasized and produced a number of very influential hypotheses about order. The layers of sound in most older ecosystems are highly co-adapted to one another. I think that's an important and powerful hypothesis. I also think that the other perspective, in that there is a certain sense of disorder and anarchic, improvisational, it's not all quite so tidy. That's what I really hear in the forest. I think both perspectives are absolutely true in something as complex as a rainforest. But yeah, his work is enormously influential culturally, because he's reaching out, say, beyond the narrow confines of academia. I mean, his training is not as, say, a bioacoustician biologist, right? He came from a musical background. And so he can make that bridge in a way that leaves the earth, leaves more people listening to the earth, which then builds hope and action into the world. So yeah, magnificent work.
That's I mean, that's exactly what the society is really about. Is about creating those bridges to different, so different people can come and talk together. Someone has mentioned that in World War I, you read about the larks singing above the sound of the artillery. Would they have adapted in such a short time, or were they just trying to sing above the noise?
Well, I mean, I don't know specifically for those larks, but certainly most songbirds, when they're singing, are highly attuned to the local environment. So if you introduce a whole load of like low frequency sound through a war or through an experimental setup where you're playing speakers out into the environment, or if you build a road through some habitat, the birds will either shut up because they're being totally masked. And so, you know, one response is silence, but the other is to increase the amplitude of, so the volume of the sound that they're producing, and also shift the frequency higher. And so, yes, that could happen through evolution, but this would just be a behavioral adaptation through, for example, the Lombard effect, which we humans have. If you're in a noisy environment, you talk louder and at a higher frequency, even without thinking about it. And other species also have this effect. So absolutely the larks would have responded. And if someone had a sound pressure meter out there, I mean, that was the last thing on people's minds if you're in the trenches of World War One.
Probably, but it's probably nice to hear the larks.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, what more amazing, I mean, this is happening right now, of course, in Ukraine, utter devastation and war happening, and in the springtime. And so the birds surely are also singing there now in this convergence of the worst aspects of humanity, of violence, with the springtime emergence of song, which is always such a hopeful and beautiful thing. And of course, that's just extraordinarily, that clash is just, it's hard to even hold in one's emotions without being destroyed by it.
No, it really is extraordinary. Someone else has asked is, what do you think of the use of ecoacoustic indices to assess the quality of the environment? And do you think we're anywhere near creating a monitoring device or thinking about using this as a way of monitoring diversity?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about that today, but in the book, I do get into this. So of course, listening, putting either with your unaided ears or by putting little recording devices that can record 24/7 and then be fed into a computer is a really powerful way of assessing the health of ecosystems, whether it's a coral reef or a rainforest or even a city. Is that using algorithms that can pull out statistical patterns from data is being used by not just by scientists, but by land managers, for example, in Borneo and in Papua New Guinea. People from the Nature Conservancy are using these sound recordings in conjunction with academics to understand how best to manage forests to preserve biodiversity. Because of course, to measure the biodiversity in a forest with a clipboard and using your eyes to identify things just takes forever. Sound samples give us a very quick, admittedly imperfect, but very quick way of getting into that. Now, of course, the downside of that is it turns scientists yet again back to our laptops, back to technologists rather than listening. And there's another form of listening that's happening, say, in tropical forests. And those are the people who've lived in the tropical forest, their cultures there for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands and thousands of years. So that's another form of sort of big data, is cultural big data. Because you want to know what's happening in the forests of Borneo, ask the indigenous peoples who are being driven from those forests now in order to make to make space for palm oil plantations. So I do think connecting the technology with the human rights aspect of habitat change is something that we need to do a better job with.
Yeah, that very much echoes the last lecture we had last Thursday night, which was how do we protect forests, and the way we protect forests is give them back to indigenous people who understand them. So that is a different, coming at that from a different way, but that's absolutely fantastic. So someone has also asked that you've really encouraged him to record sounds. So what mitigating these changes might happen? How can we mitigate the change?
Okay, so that depends a lot on context, right? So ocean sounds, so for example, seismic exploration in theory has to get approved, and there are regulatory oversight on that. So there are ways in, depending on which country you live in, there are also ways into giving feedback to those things. For closer to home, for noise in the terrestrial realm, city planning is a really, really important aspect of managing noise. And city planning in the past has tended to be highly racist and classist. Yeah. Certainly in North America, there were deliberate government policies, I mean, with a 90% cost share from the federal government to put interstates and bypasses through low-income and minority neighborhoods.
Like Queens.
With the express intention of, quote, cleaning out the ghettos and so on. And so realizing that we are building on a racist and classist legacy and doing better in the future, and I believe there are road plans in London which may not be doing quite as well, and I don't know all the details, so I can't comment specifically on those. But engaging with local policy making is where these decisions that are made, because when you put in a road or a bypass, you are changing things for decades, potentially centuries to come. So that's a place with a real point of leverage. It's not, it involves going to meetings and sitting under fluorescent lamps and dealing with, all of the various levels of local and national government, but that is a place where that can happen. I think alongside that, we need practices of joy, of connecting to and sharing the sounds of the living earth with others, because we're not, that's why, one of the reasons why we care is that these sounds connect us to other beings as a foundation for ethics, but also as a way of lifting our spirits.
Yeah. We
live in an epidemic of depression and anxiety now, rising, particularly among young people. And it's not just about the pandemic. These trends were going up before the pandemic. Disconnection and isolation is one pathway into that. And so reconnecting with the other creatures in the living earth is a way of sort of looking after ourselves, because if we are not on a slightly even keel, how can we be of any use to the other beings that need our help?
Yeah. No, I think, and can I just give a bit of a shout out for those people who are in the UK for a project which is being done at my institution, where I do my day job when I'm not being the president of the Linnean Society, which is called the Urban Nature Project, which is about looking at diversity, looking at nature in cities. And part of that project, which is all over the UK and all kinds of different places, is about acoustic monitoring and thinking about, so connecting up with one of those projects and creating a new acoustic monitoring site is a really good way to get connected into that network of people who are looking at that changing biodiversity scape, or I guess in all of its different things. So that's just it's called the Urban Nature Project, and you can just type that into Google and it will take you to the Natural History Museum website. Okay, so there's a question about whales washed up on beaches. And is this due to noise confusion? Can this be due to noise confusion?
Yeah, well, a lot of ink has been spilled on that topic. So I think my opinion is, in some cases, is pretty unambiguous evidence that, for example, very loud sonar exercises by navies has caused strandings and beachings, and in fact, physical damage to marine mammals. Other forms of beaching of whales are not quite so clearly tied to sound pollution. Of course, cause and effect is, you've got one beached whale, that's a data point of one. How do you know, was it just old, or, sometimes it is clear, right? There was a propeller strike. This creature was or
disease. There could be disease.
Yeah. But what is very clear is that marine mammals in today's oceans are leading extremely stressed lives. There was a very influential study after 9/11. So 9/11 attacks, transportation shut down, including a lot of shipping, and people in St. Lawrence were studying hormones in whale poop that they'd collect with the help of sniffer dogs on the bow of a boat. Very cool study to find whale poop floating around. And they found that when the shipping noise went down, stress levels in these whales went way down as well. And so we are creating this sort of sonic stressed out world for these beings where they can't hear one another. And even when they can, the detection distances are much, much smaller. And the thing for whales and for fish and other creatures in the oceans is that sound isn't just like through their ears. Sound is a whole body experience.
Yeah.
Because in the terrestrial world, most sound hitting my body just bounces off me. I have these very specialized devices here that translate it to an aqueous medium in my inner ears, middle ears, and inner ears. In the water, sound flows from an aquatic medium into the aquatic medium of the body, and so all of the tissues of the creature are immersed in sound. And so sound pollution is much more of a traumatic thing in the oceans as well.
Now I'm convinced my daughter turned out the way she is because I took her to a Pink Floyd concert when I was pregnant. Which is very, very loud. So someone has asked a question, which I think is a kind of really interesting one, is with the rise of electric cars, do you think this is going to help?
Well, so at low speeds, and of course, electric cars now I believe in the UK and certainly in Europe, required at low speeds to have a little sound maker in them to alert pedestrians, because of course a very quiet car is potentially dangerous for people who are used to loud engines indicating. So yes, electric cars absolutely do quiet things down, but they only do it to a certain point, because once you get above 20-30 miles an hour, a lot of the sound coming from a car is tire on road noise.
Oh, I see.
And now still, I should say the big potential is electric buses and electric large transport vehicles like trucks and lorries and things, because their engines really, particularly when they're starting off with a big load, make a lot of low frequency sound that travels a very long way. And so electrification really can help with noise pollution, but it's not the only thing that will help with that. And of course, it all depends on how many cars and trucks are out there. So if you make your, I mean, this is what's happening in the ocean. Ocean vessels, shipping vessels are often getting quieter over the years, but we've got more of them there because we're doing more international trade. And so each individual vessel is making less noise, but you've added more vessels to the roads or the oceans. And
well,
so,
and I think there's also the kind of the noise that will come from mining the lithium and nickel, which goes into the batteries, which go into electric cars. So electric cars aren't a kind of, there's a trade-off there, is, you know.
well, there's there are trade-offs, but there's also the noise that is involved in fossil fuel exploration is unbelievable. I mean, so seismic explorations are the big problem in the oceans. And so weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels really has a major impact on noise pollution.
Okay, there's well, there's sort of, we're actually over our time, so I'm just going to ask the last question. Someone was going to asked about the evolution of ears, but that's like that's a whole nother book, I think. Someone's asked something which is, I think, a really nice way to end this, is how did you get into this field? How did you become interested in sound?
Well, birds were the gateway drug.
As they often are.
Yeah, no, I mean, so birdsong really does tune one into the rhythms of the multiplicity of seasons. There aren't just 4 seasons, there are hundreds of them, about the personalities, the melodrama that's going on all around us. And then from the birds, I started listening to trees, and actually wrote a whole book called The Songs of Trees, which is about listening to trees. And it's not quite so crazy as it sounds. Every tree does have a different voice. And the ultrasound within trees can reveal things about their character, their personalities. So physiological character and personalities. So trees, and then of course, trees are rooted in the ground. And so what is the deepest story of sound on this earth? I should credit also my partner, who's a professional violinist, who opened my ears. A lot of this book is asking how do humans and non-humans fit together in the sonic world? In good ways, through music and things, and also in more challenging ways. And she really helped me understand human music in a more ecological context, because when an orchestra takes on the stage, or a rock band, you're hearing the second voice of a forest, right? There's mahogany, there's spruce, there's horsehair in the bows, there's pernambuco, all kinds of interesting cultural stories there, but really it's a very immersive ecological experience to listen to instrumental music. And one hope I have for the book is that it will help people think about music as a more ecological process rather than something that's just human.
Because it's all, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this, what an amazing talk. And there are loads and loads of comments saying wonderful lecture, absolutely amazing. I love The Song of the Trees. I've just checked out the book out of the library, another book, and I've got this book. And so I think you've really struck a chord with many of us here tonight. And thank you so much for coming along, David.
Thank you. It's a great honor.
I hope to see you at the Society one day.
I plan to come and look at Linnaeus's herbarium
fantastic
very soon.
That's fantastic. But I look forward to meeting you then. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks.
Thank you.